Hi there, it's Mrs. Hale coming at you again with Chapter 2 information. Keep in mind that you have access to this PowerPoint, but I just wanted to make sure to elaborate on some things for you. I don't have a fun little fact intro slide, but just hold on because we're going to talk about what Disney got wrong with Pocahontas and John Smith. So chapter 2 focuses on the Southern English colonies, but I wanted to take a quick moment to refresh you on kind of where we've been with chapter 1 and where we are heading. In chapter 1, we focused a lot on New Spain and how the Spanish came over to North America, Central America, and Southern America, and their influence is there. Now, obviously, this map focuses mainly on California, the Southwest, into modern-day Texas and Florida. Foreshadowing a little bit here, take a look at all this green territory for New France, and this is going to be the French territory because mainly France comes to North America in order to establish trade routes, okay, especially with the fur trapping industry, which also explains why they like the access along the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. So in red then, along the eastern coast, is going to be the 13 original colonies, and we'll focus for the next couple chapters on how they develop and how England really dominates that territory. So as a chapter 2 overview, now John Cabot had actually explored for the English in 1497, but he was a bit ahead of his time because it really wasn't until the 1500s, the mid 1500s, that we see England growing into an empire to really go out and colonize. We'll focus a bit on Jamestown, the English settlers and their interactions with the Native Americans, and then lastly, the growth of the 13 colonies, particularly in the South. So whereas the reasons for Spain colonizing we summarized easily and nicely in a pretty package, the 3 Gs, God, glory, and gold. England, it gets a bit more difficult because they've had time to grow, expand, and there are some issues going on within their own country. So it starts off with religious turmoil. In the 1530s, you had King Henry VIII. And if you know anything about him, his wives were either beheaded, divorced, or maybe lived in exile, that type of thing. And because of the divorce factor, he actually broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. And that really set up in England this turmoil, this fighting, if you will, between Catholics and Protestants. Now, keep in mind, King Henry VIII did create his own church, the Church of England, or it's also known as the Anglican Church, which caused, added to this religious turmoil. Because whatever the king was for religion, that's what the country was supposed to be. Now, you also have, as time goes on, England versus Spain. England grows into a dominant force, whereas Spain becomes a bit weaker. So the picture that you have on my screen right now is Sir Francis Drake, and he was given permission to go ahead and attack Spanish ships, which basically means he was a pirate. And he ended up taking any and all gold and silver that he actually could from the Spanish ships to enter into, like, the English treasury. And King Philip II of Spain then tried to send his strong navy, the Spanish Armada, out against the English, and they ended up getting defeated in 1588. Now, as a way to celebrate the win, if you will, England's sense of pride and unity, their sense of nationalism, as well as their rise as a world power, really increased during this time. More on land, talking about their population. So going back to chapter 1, I had talked about the Columbian Exchange, and one thing that the New World could give to the Old World was a steady supply of different food that could actually help increase their population, and people could therefore live longer, that type of thing. Think of cause effect. But because you have more people, you may not necessarily have jobs for them all, and so actually you end up with a high unemployment rate. So you're looking for a way to alleviate some of these problems. Primogeniture, number 4, is the idea that the firstborn son should always inherit the land, the business, the title, that type of thing. But then in typical practice, you would still try to have more than one son kind of as a spare in case something happened. So what ends up happening is the younger sons would either have to go into a business for themselves, some sort of trade perhaps, maybe become a lawyer, a doctor, that type of thing. Or they could become explorers and go to the New World. For number 5, you also have this idea of a joint stock company. So there were 3 different types of colonies that were founded. One was a joint stock colony that was basically a corporation. Some sort of company would foot the bill to go settle, okay? You then have a royal colony, which was established directly by a monarch. And then you have a proprietary colony, which would be the king or queen giving specific person or people permission to go found a colony on their behalf. So in this image, you have Queen Elizabeth I, and she is portrayed as being very serene and having sovereign power, which means complete power. But it could also be used as propaganda, and I would encourage you to stop and pause for a moment and think, why is this propaganda? Because it just looks like a picture to me, right? But you might start to notice, okay, the picture's behind her. Maybe this is England. Maybe this is Spain with their defeat of the Spanish Armada. Maybe because it's light, it's a symbol of goodness and hope versus the darkness of evil. Look at how Queen Elizabeth has her hand on a globe instead of perhaps holding the globe up. So you just begin to wonder, could this actually be used as propaganda? So the colonial areas that I'm going to talk about today are going to be what's in green: Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Really starting in Virginia, looking at Jamestown first, and then we'll kind of go from there. But I just also wanted to show you more of this area as to what becomes and eventually develops into the 13 original colonies. So Jamestown was founded in 1607, and it was founded by the Virginia Company. So King James I chartered the Virginia Company to found the colony. And what is really interested by that charter is that any settler that then came over to Jamestown ended up with the same equal rights as people who lived back home in England. They were on the same footing as far as citizenship goes. So it's just kind of interesting how some of these seeds are planted so far in advance of even things like the Revolutionary War. The plan for the Jamestown was actually to make money and not establish a long-term colony, which we see like May 24th, 1607, 100 men, some women, arrived in Jamestown, and they were there to dig for gold and other spices. They were not there to really establish themselves as a colony. Now, they did end up settling in a swamp, so it did prove to be tricky as far as establishing homes, building them, but then even fending off for disease, right? So the result of their problems, okay, in Jamestown is this death from disease, starvation. People weren't taking care of themselves because they were just digging for gold. You do have John Smith, who said, "He who shall not work shall not eat," and basically laid down the law for 5 years, leading the colony, establishing themselves, and trying to get people to work. John Rolfe, he comes in and he saves Virginia, we say, or Jamestown, because he ends up introducing tobacco, and it becomes the cash crop of Virginia. Now, later problems will emerge because, for example, within a short period of time, Jamestown's founded in 1607. By 1624, there had been over 6,000 people that came to settle the area, but only 2,000 people survived. The Virginia Company was actually in debt and could no longer foot the bill for the colony. And so King James I then revoked their charter, and it became a royal colony. Part of that, not only because of Virginia Company's debt, but also part of that was because King James I hated tobacco. Even though it was becoming his cash crop and what really saved them, he didn't like tobacco, and he mistrusted the House of Burgesses, which I'll talk about here in a moment. Just a video for you to enjoy later in life. Let's talk about the early English interactions with Native Americans. So you have the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. Now remember, Anglo is another word like Anglican Church, English, okay? So what ends up happening is Lord de la Warr at this time is going to be in charge of some of the southern region in Virginia. And what happens is he had very strict, harsh rules and policies against the Indians. And therefore he butted heads with the tribal leader, Powhatan. The English destroyed the natives' villages, burned their crops, burned their storehouses, and war basically broke out between them. Now, the war ended in 1614 with John Rolfe marrying Pocahontas, which was a form of a peace treaty, and it was deemed like the first interracial marriage in Virginia. Now, I said, part of the fun facts would be, what did Disney get wrong, right? And I'll have to fix that video link. But if you think about Disney, it seems they portray that it's really John Smith and Pocahontas that get together, because Pocahontas dramatically falls on, John Smith and is like, "I'll save him, father." And, the fight breaks up and stuff like that. So unless you watch Pocahontas 2, which I don't think I've even seen, it's in that movie that you then see her married to John Rolfe and moving to England. So the Second Anglo-Powhatan War takes place later on, 1630s, 1640s. And it was basically the Indians launching raids against the white settlers, okay? And the Powhatan was really upset because the Native Americans were getting moved off their land. They were getting exposed to all these diseases that was decimating them. And so they tried to retaliate by launching their own raids. And it was deemed that this was going to be a perpetual war without peace or truce. So in 1646, there was, it's funny, they call it a peace treaty, but is it really peace, right? Banished the Indians from their own land with no hope of coexisting and intermarrying or assimilating between Indians and England settlers. And I think that perfectly summarizes how the English are going to treat the Indians from here on out. No sense of being able to live with each other, having no value, that type of idea. Now, I'd already touched on this a little bit. Virginia did have success, okay? 1612, tobacco was introduced, and it became known as King Nicotine. Not only because it became the cash crop, which means it's very lucrative, earning England a lot of money, but also kind of the way nicotine can take over you. It ruined the soil, and it also forced the establishment of the plantation system, very similarly to the sugar plantations that were discussed in Chapter 1. Now, eventually, Virginia is able in 1619 to establish their own sense of a mini parliament in America, and it becomes known as the House of Burgesses. And this is actually going to last all the way through into the 1700s till we get to the Revolutionary War. But this, keep in mind, I'd said when the Virginia Company was granted a charter, and the people coming to America were equal citizens with those people living in England, right? Well, now in Virginia, they even have like this mini parliament for representative government of the people. So just kind of interesting what gets founded here. So Maryland, when they are founded, okay, by King Charles I, was basically established for religious diversity. Persecuted Catholics could find refuge here and their safe haven. But then Lord Baltimore, whose real name is George Calvert, ended up giving huge amounts of land, huge estates, prime location as well, whether by water, for fertile soil, that type of thing, to his Catholic relatives. And the poor people who settled into Maryland were mostly Protestant. And so it caused a lot of friction, once again, between the two religions. But Maryland prospered with tobacco, and they ended up having a lot of indentured servants. Now, at the time, we start to see the difference between an indentured servant and even a slave, right? So I'm sure you understand a slave is owned by someone else and you are not granted your freedom, right? An indentured servant, however, would be someone who came to North America because someone else had paid their way. And so you would be beholden to whoever brought you over from England, right? You would be beholden to them for a certain amount of years. Once you've worked off your debt, you're free to go. Now, in Maryland, you had the Act of Toleration, which was established in 1649. And it's ironic. It guaranteed religious toleration to all Christians, but said that there would be the death penalty to anyone who's Jewish, atheist, or others who didn't believe in Jesus, right? So by the late 1600s, that whole Protestant versus Catholics flared up again. By the late 1600s, Protestant resentment against the Catholics increased. And the Protestants ended up getting a bit of a victory because the Act of Toleration was repealed and Catholics lost their right to vote in elections. Now, does it mean equal footing? No, but you see how this religious turmoil continues on. So the West Indies and talking about the Barbados slave codes, right? So by the mid-1600s, Spain had lost their power in the West Indies, and now you have England taking over. And they really established a lot of sugar plantations on those islands. And I'm talking about like in the Caribbean, if you will. So here's the deal with sugar plantations. You had to be wealthy to run a plantation. You needed a vast amount of land, you needed labor, and the equipment was expensive that you needed. Now, the labor did come in the form of slavery, okay, and to the point that in the West Indies, slaves outnumbered whites 4-1, okay? Because of that, and because of the fear of rebellion, you have the Barbados slave codes that were established in 1661, and those officially defined the legal state of slaves and the rights of their masters over them. So we had talked about Virginia and Maryland, continuing on down the coastline now. The Carolinas are interesting, okay, because originally they were founded as one. And what ends up happening is the Carolinas were able to be very successful, especially Southern Carolina, because of their port access, their water access. Rice and eventually indigo does become their cash crop, and African slaves were brought over to the Carolinas because it turned out that they had an immunity to malaria, which we would oftentimes find in the hot, humid, swampy weather of the Carolinas. Now, the Carolinas were oftentimes attacked by the Spanish and the Indians. For example, the result of that, if you will, right, is that the English ended up crushing, especially the Indians here. The Tuscarora and Yamasee tribes were crushed by the early 1700s in the Carolinas, and then the coastal tribes were pretty much non-existent, all because of the English coming to their area. So now talking about the division here of the Carolinas. So newcomers, especially to North Carolina, were deemed squatters, okay, who didn't own land, and they usually came from Virginia. And this is where we start to see the difference in attitude between North Carolinians and South. So the North Carolinians were oftentimes strong-willed, resistant to authority, least aristocratic, meaning they're not holding to titles, nobility, your caste system, if you will. And they were independent-minded, and just because of the geography, they oftentimes tended to be the small tobacco farms, okay? Compare that to South Carolina. They tended to be wealthier. They tended to have larger plantations. They ended up earning their money because of slaves, because of trading furs to the West Indies, And by 1670, Charleston had really been established and started to grow into a major city. And so by 1712, they were officially separated. Side note, one of my favorite things is when your textbook authors talk about North Carolina and how they were squatters. So enjoy reading that section. So last little bit here, Georgia is founded by James Oglethorpe. And this is going to be, it's interesting because this colony was actually founded with direct government aid from London. And no other colony had been given so much money directly, not through a company, not through a crown, but like the actual government in London was like, take this money, go found it, right? And part of the reason why is because it was going to be used as a buffer colony. B/T is between the British colonies, Spanish Florida, and then the French in Louisiana. The British colonies, particularly South Carolina, was super important. And earning the crown a lot of money. So they wanted to buffer it, if you will. Georgia also became a debtors colony. And with that, what do I mean by it? Because you had overpopulation, people unemployed, you had high debt going on in England, and the jails were crowded. So it was a way to solve the problem. Now, because of it becoming a bit of a debtors colony, James Oglethorpe kept very strict moral rules. No drinking rum, no slavery, that type of thing. And in Georgia, all Christians except Catholics enjoyed religious toleration. So here are your colonial areas that we just talked about. Again, just always refreshing your minds as to the map work here, right? So keep in mind, in general, these plantation colonies, what do they all have in common? Slavery is eventually in all of these colonies. The growth of cities, yes, Savannah, Georgia does grow to be fairly large. Same thing with Charleston, that type of idea. But a lot of the cities were stunted because of the geography, because of the forests and other natural barriers. The establishment of schools and churches proved to be difficult because more people were spread out, especially on the plantation system. And so it's not like you had your town, you didn't have the pop-up towns that all had their single church, their single school, that type of thing. I lay that foundation because you'll see the contrast between the South with churches and schools versus what goes on in the northern colonies, okay? Keep in mind just the southern crops, tobacco, rice, indigo, some religious toleration depending on who you were and where you lived, and then confrontation with the Native Americans was often. So that ends my slides for chapter 2. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and ask, but otherwise, we'll catch you guys on the flip side.